let's use photo merge again, and let's create something that looks different than a normal panorama. Here's the actual shots I'm going to combine. We're at Devil's Tower. And I want to produce this, where it looks like a stack of prints sitting there, instead of looking like a seamless panorama. So let's try it out. I'm going to select all these. I'm going to choose Tools, Photoshop, Photo Merge. But when I put this together, I don't want a seamless panorama. I want to see the seams. And so I'm going to turn off the checkbox called Blend Images Together, which means it's not going to apply the feature that's called Auto Blend Layers. It's not going to make it so the brightnesses match and that there's no seams. So all I'm doing is turning that off. But then I don't want it to be able to distort the pictures by bending them in any way. So one of the choices down here is called Collage. And what collage means is only scale and rotate. Don't bend. Don't distort. And so I'll click OK. So we're just doing the scale and rotate and don't blend them together. We could have done that manually. We could have come in and said load files into Photoshop layers to stack them and then choose auto align layers. It also has that choice called collage. So here now we have these individual layers. And now let's see how can I make it look more like our end result, because right now, to be honest, it looks way too seamless. If I look really hard, I can tell that there are some seams. If I look right up in here, I can see the edge of that photo just the littlest bit because of the brightness difference. That's mainly because with my lens, there's vignetting, which means the edges, the corners are a little bit darker, which causes that to not match. But I want it to be blatantly obvious. So let's see if there's any way I can figure out how to do that. If you look in the Layers panel, it delivered a separate layer for each one of those. We're working on the top layer right now. And let's try out a feature that's found at the bottom of the Layers panel. And that feature is the letters FX. There are two terms used for what's found under this menu. One is called a layer effect, layer effects, and the other is called a layer style. And Adobe uses those two terms interchangeably as if they mean the same thing. So if you ever see the word layer style and you see the word layer effect, they are the same. It's just that I don't know why they didn't standardize. So I click on FX, and there's a list of effects I can apply to this layer. I'm going to apply an effect that's called stroke. Stroke means draw a line around the edge of me. So when I say the edge of me, I mean the edge of this layer. So I choose stroke. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but if you look at the picture, there's a black line right now being drawn around the edge of this. I can control the size of that black line, the thickness, right here with a setting called size. If I bring it up like this, it's going to be 29 pixels wide. Can you see it now? Then down below, there's a choice called color, and that's what color the line is. I'll click on that, and when I do, it brings up a color picker. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose white, but then I'm going to drag down the tiniest bit so that we got something the littlest bit darker than white. Why? Because when we're all done, if I were to print my end result on a white sheet of paper, I want to still be able to tell the difference between this border that's around my picture and the empty part of the paper that we printed on. And right now, this checkerboard is the area where my paper would be when I print this. These two would be identical if this was white when I print. So I'm just going the tiniest bit darker than white. Click OK. And I'll adjust the size. And I'm just thinking, how can I make that look like it's an old style print back when they print and leave a little white border around the edge. I'll click OK, and then I want to get more separation by having a shadow between these two. So it almost feels like one is floating above the other. I'll go back down to the letters FX, and I find a choice within there called Drop Shadow. That's what that's going to do. When I choose Drop Shadow, there are a couple choices in here we need to adjust. There's a whole bunch of settings, but there's really about 3 settings that are important. One is distance. That's how far is the shadow away from the layer. And if I move the distance up, can you see the shadow over there in my picture? And you might not be aware of this if you've used this before, but you can actually click on your image and drag while this is open. And it changes 2 settings. It changes the angle setting, which is what angle away from this does the shadow go at, and the distance setting. So if you just stare at the settings in this dialog box, watch the angle and the distance when I drag. See them moving? You can see that because I know it's pretty small on your screen, but you can only do that while this is open, where you got the settings. Then the other setting that's important is one called size. Size controls how soft the edge is. It's kind of weird they call it size, but the higher the size is, the softer the shadow. And one final setting that's semi-important is opacity. Opacity is how prominent is that shadow, how much does it show up. If you bring it up, you're going to get a dark shadow. Bring it down, it shows up less and less. So when we add a drop shadow, there's actually quite a few important settings, but what they are is angle is what direction is the light coming from. Whatever direction this thing points at, the light source it's pointing at. So it thinks the light is in the upper left right now. So therefore the shadow goes the other way. Distance means how far away from the layer does the shadow cast. Size is how soft the edge is. And then opacity is how bright or dark it is. I'll click OK. Now I have that on the top layer. What I'd really like to do is get it applied to the other layers too. And there's a bunch of different ways of doing that. First, I could come in and manually do it to each layer. But it would be hard to get the same settings without writing them down. So they wouldn't look consistent. And I'm way too lazy for that, right? So if you look in the Layers panel, it shows me the effects that I've applied. They're attached to the layer in a way that's not permanent. If I were to turn off the eyeball on either one of these, I could turn off those effects. So if I turn off the eyeball on the stroke, it'd go away. We just temporarily disabled the stroke feature. I turn the eyeball back on by clicking where the eyeball used to show up, right here, and it'll turn on again. I could turn off the drop shadow. Or the word effects means all of those things. So if I click on this one, it collectively turns them all off. But here's what's cool. I can click on the word effects and drag it onto a different layer, and we'll move it to that layer. I can click on the word effects and drag it to a different layer, and I'll move it there. There is a keyboard shortcut in Photoshop where one of the things that this key does is like a standard, is it duplicates things. Depending on what it is you drag on, you're going to duplicate whatever it is you drag. And that is the Option key, Alt and Windows. And we'll get used to that throughout the day because we'll use it a bunch. But one of the things we could hold it down and drag are these effects. So right now I'm going to hold down the Option key, Alt and Windows, and keep it held down. And I'm just going to drag the word effects to the bottom layer. Then I'm going to drag the word effects to whatever layers doesn't already have it. And you see how I have it in all of them now. All right? Now, zoom out here. We have the checkerboard, which to me is distracting. The checkerboard simply means it's empty. And I'd rather have something there. Just white would be fine, just so it doesn't look distracting. So I want to put something in there. There are many different ways I can do that. But there's a special kind of layer we can have. It's a layer that's just full of a solid color, and it fills your entire document. And if your document ever gets bigger for some reason, it expands to fill the space. And to get one of those special layers, you go to this icon right here. Usually that's where you apply adjustments, actually. But at the very top of the menu, there's a choice called Solid Color. That means create something called a solid color layer. I'll choose it. And when I do, it'll ask me what color I'd like to use, and I'll choose white. So now what I have is a layer full of white. The problem is the layer is at the top of the layer stack. And it's as if we're standing at the top of the layer stack looking down, and that layer full of white is blocking our view of everything that's under it. So what I need to do is drag that layer down. I'll drag it down below the first layer, and now if you're at the top of the Layers panel, you could see that first layer before you saw the white stuff that's below it. And I just need to continue dragging it down further and further until I get it all the way to the bottom. So that now it's the pictures that are on top that are obscuring our view of the white thing. Now I see one problem with my image. At the bottom and on the right edge, do you see where the drop shadows are? Don't they go beyond the edge of the picture? So I need to do something to make my document larger so we have room for that drop shadow that we have added. There's a bunch of different ways you can do that. You can actually use the crop tool and pull it, instead of making your image smaller by pulling the cropping rectangle in, you can pull it out beyond the edge of your document to add space. Or I can have Photoshop do it for me. I can go to the image menu and there's a choice called Reveal All. What Reveal All means is if I move any part of my document, anything in it, so it extends beyond the bounds of this document. Make my document bigger so I can see anything that's going beyond the edge. So when I choose Reveal All, watch what happens. Boom, there, just added space for it. Just enough space for it. So we did a bunch to this image, and before we really analyze it, let's take a look in the Layers panel and let's try to simplify. Because right now the layers, I have to scroll up and down to see the whole thing. So if I look at one of my layers, you remember we have the effects we added. We added a stroke and a drop shadow. In the place we got those from was at the bottom of the Layers panel. We clicked on a layer, we went down to the bottom of the Layers panel where we found the letters FX, clicked there, and that's where we found stroke and drop shadow. And those are called layer effects or layer styles. They use those two words interchangeably. Well, whenever you add those, you also have the word effects here, and that means collectively all of those effects you've applied. You could turn them off all at once, or you could turn them off individually. Well, to me, the problem is this is cluttering my Layers panel. So there's another indicator that these effects are being applied, and that is when we went to the bottom of the Layers panel, you remember that icon that's there that says FX? Well, look at that icon, and you notice the same icon is right there. That's a little badge to say this layer has some of those applied. And you see the triangle next to it? If you click that, it'll collapse the list of effects. Click it again, it expands it. But when it's collapsed, that icon indicates there's some of those there. You just need to expand the list to see them. Right? So I'm going to collapse it on each one by clicking on the little triangle on each one. So now if we look at our Layers panel, what do we got? Well, at the base, we have something called a solid color layer. And that means it's a layer that doesn't contain a picture, it contains a color. What's cool about a solid color layer is this thing right here tells you the color. It shows you what color is being used. And if you double click on that, it brings up the color picker. And you can change it any color you want at any time. So I'll make something more like that. Click OK. And all I did is I clicked right here. You actually have to double click, and that brought up the color picker. So at any time we can change that. Then above that we have our layers, which were in there. They were put together by doing the photo merge command. And the main thing is we turned off a checkbox that was called something like blend images together or something that was at the bottom. And that caused it to keep them as separate images where they're not seamless. And to make it more obvious where the edges were, we added layer effects, a stroke and a drop shadow. All right? So now we have these layers. We pretty much have our complete image. So I'll come over here, choose Save As. And I need to choose a file format that supports layers, usually TIFF or Photoshop. Lately, I've been more standardizing on TIFF. I'll just use default settings in there most of the time. All right, any questions about what we did there? Bunch of stuff. But the main thing is we did photo merge, but we turned off a checkbox that usually makes it seamless because we wanted the seams. And also when we did photo merge, we told it to only scale and rotate. That was the choice called collage. And then we just made it more obvious where those edges were by adding strokes and drop shadows.